I'm Meredith Sue Willis, and I'm recording a little bit about what scene is, what's important about scene, and then this workshop that we're doing will be doing some more practical things with that. Obviously, the question is why scene? Why am I making this big deal about scene? Why would I do a whole 3-hour workshop on scene? This, of course, is scene in prose narrative. So that's to include memoir, it's to include stories, certainly novels. And as I'm sure you know, it's also an important word that's used similarly in the other arts like film and theater and elsewhere. This is you've all heard of show and tell, and how in lively writing, it's important to show and not tell. I think that's overdone, but scene is the quintessential showing. It's the point at which everything is dramatized. The words that are most important to me about scene are that this is where the story is dramatized, and it's also where people experience the story. So I'll say more about that, but I want to come to this page first, the share screen, because I actually want to say something first about about other things that are parts of scene. When you have time, there's some material online, and I'll be leaving this web page up for at least a month. There's some material about scene that you can click through. So for example, here, if you look at my cursor, you'll see an example of non-scenic narration, and it's very important to know this is sometimes the best way to tell your story. So for example, maybe all you need is he went into the store and bought a paper. The clerk was disturbed by his appearance and manner. But on the other hand, you may want to bring this to life. You may want to dramatize it. You may want to make it easier for somebody to use their imagination and their empathy and to experience it. So here is a scene version of that. He walked into the store. He was as pale as a mushroom raised in darkness. I wrote this particularly for this example. It's not supposed to be good writing, and the more I read it, the worse it gets. He was pale as a mushroom raised in darkness, his clothes loose and also mushroom colored. She watched him stand for a long time in front of the newspapers and finally take one from the pile of dailies. "How much is it?" he asked, holding it out as if it might be poisoned. 50 cents, she said. "Oh." He continued to hold it out with one hand while he got out a wallet with the other, worked out $1, never taking his eyes off her or lowering the paper. She made his change quickly and he walked out. "I don't like the looks of that," she said to herself. "That is creepy." So that was only to demonstrate what I mean. So when I say scene, I mean something. It can be tiny, it can be short. I mean something that you can picture it, hear it, see it, smell it. There's usually a little description. There are big actions, there's small actions. So it's a physical, and dramatized scene. I also, though, want to point out how some of the most wonderful writing in the world is sometimes not a scene, but narrative. And this is one of the most famous narratives in the world, maybe the greatest summary in 20th century literature. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's from the Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and I would hope that you get a chance to read it on your own. But as you see, it's around page 90 of To the Lighthouse, and they've had all this excitement at the people at their summer place at the ocean, and then they leave for the winter, and there's a long description about wind and destruction, and there's a he who we're not quite sure who it is. And then here's the famous part, this little part in brackets, and Virginia Woolf put the brackets in too, where out of all this description, suddenly we get this sentence: "Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage one dark morning, stretched his arms out, but Mrs. Ramsay, having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though stretched out, remained empty." And then we go into a long description of the empty house back at the beach. The point here is that is exactly what she wanted there. That Mrs. Ramsey is probably the most important character into the lighthouse. And for this moment where she dies, it is not a Dickens type death scene where people come and talk and you know, and there's excitement, there's emotion and misery and all that. Instead, we just get that one little bit of summary. My point is that one of the biggest decisions you have to make in writing fiction or dramatized nonfiction like memoir is when to summarize and when to dramatize. That is not something that anybody can ever tell you. I mean, you can critique and say, I think it should be, but this is actually to me one of the biggest things to figure out. When do you need to have the whole thing for me to experience as a reader, and when do you want just a sharp bit of summary 10 years later? Okay, let me say something about where I think scenes and those things like that came from. I've always imagined that people first began telling stories when they came back to the fire after everybody had been out getting food all day, and the people who'd been out gathering. So maybe the hunters had been out and had no success, but I imagine the gatherers came back and they were attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. So they want everybody to share their experience. They may also want the rest of the people to know how well they did with this situation. They may want to know a lot of things, but they began telling the story, you know, like the tiger came out, we had to run. But somebody along the line realized it would make a stronger story, a bigger impact, if they said things like, and suddenly the tiger came out of the weeds and its mouth was as big as this. So they began using gestures, and they said, and it had saliva dripping out of its teeth. And then we called to the children, run, run, and we'll stay and fight. So they added some dialogue to it. So suddenly, instead of just the events, they've got everybody leaning on the edge of their seat to find out what happened next. The people can see it in their minds. And you know, and we think about ancient stories that we really have. I mean, that was clearly a made up story of mine, but we think about ancient stories like fairy tales, fables, parables. We think of them as being little narratives, but almost always they do have a scene in them. And I'm thinking about the Fox and the Grapes. I've been telling my 5-year-old granddaughter Aesop's fables over video because I can't be with her. And one of the things I'm realizing is these fables, they all have their little moral, we all know their teaching, but they usually have drama. So the Fox and the Grapes has only one character and not much happens, but there is action and there is dialogue. There's a point at which the fox leaps to get the grapes and falls, and then he leaps again, and then he falls again. And then at however many times, you know, the storyteller wants to do that. And finally he says, oh, those are just sour grapes anyway. And so in other words, it's tiny, it's 4 lines, but it is dramatized. It's a scene. So again, the question, of course, is when do you do that and when not? Let me go back to the share screen and get through the rest of this material. I have this elsewhere, so I'm not going to say much about it, but it's a word it's a term that's common to theater, film, video, and fiction, as well as memoir and nonfiction. And as you know, in common speech, we talk about scene as the place where action or event occurs, scene of the crime. It's also sometimes used to refer to a public display of passion or temper. She tried not to make a scene, but all the uses of the word have to do with something something dramatic happening. Generally in the theater and movies and in fiction, it's also a unit of action. It's usually continuous time, at least stable characters. I mean, sometimes more people come in, although in theater, generally when more people enter a scene, it actually becomes another scene. I mean, that's theater. But above all, it's a dramatized moment. And sometimes even discursive, slow building novelists in the 19th century and early 20th century, people like Henry James or Proust, they would take, some, I don't know, 20 pages of their meandering, sometimes insufferable descriptions and on and on and on. And then suddenly, both of them, and they are great writers, both of them will suddenly come out of all this description and going round and round the bush, and there will be something compact, something where the people suddenly start speaking to one another, gesturing, and something happens. It usually centers on dialogue. Everything in a scene is particular. There's the time, the weather, what people are wearing, expressions, gesture, the timbre of the voices. And we participate with our imaginations and our emotions as if it were happening to us. Some of you who've taken novel writing with me have heard me say one of, I think, the best exercises for a novel, but it certainly is true for a story of any length or a memoir, is to write down 15 or some other arbitrary number, shorter for a shorter piece, number of the main scenes of the story. Just make them up. Say these are the things that are going to happen. They meet, they have a fight, they pass on, they go away from each other for 10 years, they meet each other again. And after you've written all these down, you have something very close to an outline, a certain kind of outline. And then the procedure would be to draft them. In my own work, I tend to start kind of randomly. Something interests me. I write until I get bored, until I run out of things to write. I tell myself a story. And then at some point, it happens for me. It begins to sharpen up, and I actually see the people, not just thinking, talking, remembering, but actually acting with one another. All right, this stuff is going to be there to read, so I'm going to just come to the end of it. Actually, I think I'm going to stop there, because I do want to talk a little bit about a couple of specific scenes from literature. The one thing I wanted to add, though, was that I was talking as if this were about the reader, about what they experience and how you draw them into the story. But the reason I talked about my own process is that is also the way I write, that when things begin to come together for me, I find a focus. It comes in the form of a story, a scene. It comes in the form of something happening in something like real time, and action and drama and people talking together. So it actually is, for me at least, is part of how I write. So it's for me, the writer, as well as for people who are readers. Now, I want to see if I can stop the recording.